Welcome to another wonderful Susanna Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susanna Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Reluctant Sheriff. Chapter 1. On the fifth morning of her new life, Pamela Hastings dressed with care. It was her mother's dress, handed down, thrice mended, and adjusted to fit Pamela's figure, which remained slim and girlish even in her 23rd year. Once upon a time, Lydia Savant Hastings had been sturdy and robust, an inch taller and several pounds heavier than her only daughter, but that was long ago, before her illness had wasted her away to a pale imitation of the woman she had once been. Pamela could not mourn her mother as she had been at the end of her life. Those last few years had been nothing but pain, long drawn out. She did, however, mourn the spry, laughing, good-hearted woman that had raised her alone, raised her with courage and strength and always with kindness. Not for the first time, Pamela was struck with the reminder that now, at the last, she was entirely alone in the world. The dress was a mourning dress, black and severe in its plainness. She tucked her mother's one remaining piece of jewelry, a bone-white cameo scarcely the size of the tip of her little finger, underneath the high collar. It wouldn't do to be seen wearing ornaments, less than a week after her mother's pauper's burial, but she couldn't bear the thought of going into battle without it, as though it were a talisman against harm. And that was precisely what she intended to do today. She would wage a war, in the only way she could. The time had come to settle accounts, and she had few weapons at her disposal. She intended to use every one of them. She stood back and took a long, scrutinizing look at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the washbasin. The room reflected behind her was nearly empty, apart from the little cot where she slept and the slightly larger bed where her mother had spent her last months. The creditors had taken everything else, taking them to destinations yet unknown, though she suspected that many of her family's belongings had been added to the spacious rooms of the home belonging to their chief. And yet the debt remained, when she had nothing left to give. Her eyes diverted from the sparseness of the room and settled on her own features, the pale, oval face, with wide brown eyes and a delicate nose and mouth, framed by a mass of dark golden curls that she could not seem to train into place, no matter how hard she tried. She tried again, knowing it would be ineffectual. She felt strongly that she needed to be as composed and professional as possible, on this day of all days, the day when accounts were to be settled. Her mother had left no will. She'd had nothing to bequeath, and no one apart from Pamela to bequeath it to. The two of them had been the last of the Hastings family. Pamela's father had passed away when she was only 2 years old, and in the years since grandparents and aunts and uncles alike had succumbed to old age, disease, and the vagaries of fate. Life had been difficult enough even with the two of them working hard to provide for themselves, in the mean streets of New York, where kindness and fellow feeling was rendered scarce by the hard times which had befallen everyone in their neighborhood. Once Lydia had been taken ill and had been unable to recover, the debts had slowly mounted. Even before Lydia's illness, she had secured loans from the richest man any of them knew, Daniel Darnan, a merchant who lived a few streets outside of their neighborhood, in the wealthy side of town, of course. In Pamela's time of need, at her wits' end and not knowing where else to turn, she too had accepted loans from Mr. Darnan. And now, she took a deep breath and steadied herself. Now, it was time to make arrangements. More than once on the long walk to Mr. Darnan's offices, she nearly turned back. But she had no real choice except to continue moving forward. At last, with the comfort and familiarity of her own streets left far behind her, she turned into the tall brownstone building that housed Mr. Darnan's store, and above it, his office. The secretary admitted her into the inner room with scarcely more than a well-bred murmur, and all too soon she found herself standing before Darnan himself. He was not an imposing man, at first glance, being rather slight. Outside, he was always hatted, but here in his office she clearly saw the slight shine of his balding pate between the carefully combed strands of his lank brown hair. He could have been 40, 50, or even 60, his face did not show lines, but neither did it show life and warmth. When he looked up and smiled, it did not reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Hastings. I've been expecting you. She nodded, both a mark of respect and a greeting. Her heart was thumping so hard that she could feel it at the back of her teeth. Good morning, Mr. Darnan. I have come to settle accounts. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together and eyeing her. He had the eyes of a sea creature, sharp and watchful and unknowable. She squared her shoulders and met them squarely. So soon? It has not yet been a week since your poor mother passed. I would rather do so as quickly as possible, Mr. Darnan. I see. Am I to take it, then, Miss Hastings, that you have unexpectedly come into a small fortune? She pressed her lips together and shook her head. The motion caused a few of her carefully pinned locks to come loose. She could feel them fall around her face. His eyes snapped to them, even more watchful, and there was a crafty expression in them that she did not care for at all. No, I'm afraid not. Said Daniel Darnan, tapping his lips with his joined fingers. How is it, then, that you expect to settle our account? I'm ready and willing to allow you the time to truly do so, Miss Hastings, but in the absence of remuneration. Now was the time to unleash her weapon, paltry though she feared it to be. Mr. Darnan, she said, after my mother died, I was visited by an old family friend. John Montgomery, perhaps you know the name? Darnan tilted his head, one eyebrow raising. I do indeed, he said. A very well-known lawyer. Yes. He worked with my father, years ago, and has met with my mother now and again. He took me aside, and based on his long history with my parents, made free to give me some advice. Oh. He informed me, Pamela said, schooling her voice and expression into solidity, desperate not to let her fear show through, that the terms of your loans to both my mother and myself have been unscrupulous, perhaps even criminal. For what little we have received, we have given you everything, and Mr. Montgomery advised me to refuse to give up anything more and suggested that he will represent me in the court of law if you choose to object. For all her fear, it was almost gratifying to see the way his expression changed. For the first time, she recognized the emotion that fueled him. It was sheer anger, and it elated her. Her little weapon had struck home. She held her breath, waiting for his response, and after a moment, he managed to control himself enough to speak. I am certain, Miss Hastings, that his advice was well meant, but I'm afraid that it is poorly founded. We have a perfectly legitimate agreement, and any court in the land would back me up. She shook her head. Perhaps what is on paper is legitimate, she said. But that doesn't account for everything you have already taken from my family over the years, things that did not belong to you, but which you labeled interest. His smile did not falter, if anything, it only grew. Ah, my dear Miss Hastings, that is the price of business, I'm afraid, and the price of life, in these hard times. But my concern is only for you. Would you really push yourself to such an extent? Your strength, your emotions. She stiffened. The way he spoke the words made her hair stand on end. Now, my dear, he went on, purely out of my concern for you, I have a soft heart, after all, and I've always known that it would be to my detriment someday. I am willing to make you an offer. You can't possibly hope to truly win everything you desire in the courts. No judge will rule entirely in your favor, regardless of whether Mr. Montgomery speaks up for you or not. We do have a signed contract, after all, and I am entitled to what you agreed to pay. The past is, he waved a hand dismissively. The past. It's the future you should think of. Her heart was beating even faster. She had felt, for just a moment, that she had the upper hand, and now, with the change in his tone, she feared that she had made some great misstep, of which she was still ignorant. What do you mean, Mr. Darnan? Another smile that made her feel like ice. I mean just this, my dear. I will forgive all your debt and return your family's belongings, if you agree to marry me. Her heart sank and her hands began to tremble. What? She asked softly. Could she possibly have heard him aright? A marriage contract to replace the terms of your loan. I think you'll find that it's more than fair, given the circumstances. After all, you have no one left in the world, now that your dear mother is at last at rest, and I have been giving considerable thought to marrying again, after the death of my own dear wife last year. At the risk of undue flattery, Miss Hastings, you are far from plain. Indeed, I believe you would be quite an ornament to the elegance of my home. A feminine touch which it has been sorely lacking. It was difficult to fight a response from her lips. Her throat felt as though it were tightening up. She still couldn't quite believe that he meant it, but he kept on looking at her with that expectant expression, that little smile hovering around the edges of his lips, and gradually it dawned on her that he meant every word. He would force her to take him to court, facing the humiliation of her poverty and the prospect of failure in the end, or she could agree to his hand in marriage. Either way, she would be giving him direction over the rest of her life. But what choice did she have? She had nowhere else to go. If she turned him down, it would only be a matter of a few days before he evicted her from the little house in which she had been born and raised, in which both mother and father had died, the only home she'd ever known. And he would pursue her for payment of the rest of her debt, she was certain, now that she had raised his ire. There would be nowhere in New York that she could run for protection. Oh, it was true that Mr. Montgomery had offered to represent her in court. But that didn't put a roof over her head tonight, did it? Still, she couldn't bring herself to agree to his terms, not free and clear. She shuddered at the very thought. He was waiting for a response. She could not hesitate any longer without arousing his suspicion as to her intentions. Breathing a swift, silent prayer to the heavens, she took a deep breath. "I thank you for your consideration, Mr. Darnan. It is indeed a difficult situation in which I find myself, and I am very aware of how much I owe to others." She bit her lip. "Will you allow me a day to think about it before I make my decision? After all, it's not even been a week since my mother's burial, and it would hardly be right to rush into something like this while I'm in mourning." He tilted his head, eyeing her as though already suspicions were running through his mind, but then gave her a single nod of agreement. "Very well, Miss Hastings. I'm certain that, upon reflection, you will make the right decision. After all, the debt is entirely on your side. I have no reason other than my soft heart to allow such a solution. You would be, frankly, taking advantage of me, but I will choose to allow it. In fact, in view of the circumstances, I consider our new contract to be already in effect." He gave her a final knowing smile. "Mr. Dawkins will show you out of my office. I will expect you back here tomorrow morning, promptly at 8. Her heart hammering at her ribs, she bowed her head as though in agreement and turned back to the door into the outer office. She was scarcely aware of following his secretary out into the hallway and then finding her way back out into the weak sunshine of early spring. The chill in the air brought her to her senses, and she lifted her head, eyes staring wildly and unseeing. Marry that man? Why, she couldn't. She wouldn't. She refused, utterly and absolutely. But he considered them as good as engaged. He'd said as much. If she backed out now, what further punishment might he see fit to wreak on her? He had already expanded the terms of former loans, taking what little she had though he had no right to it. What else might he do? Have her thrown in jail for failure to repay? One thing was certain, no matter what course he chose, she was no longer safe in New York. The city in which she had been born and raised held nothing but pain for her now. Blindly, she walked through the streets, heading deeper into the city rather than returning back to the neighborhood she knew well. Again and again, with every step, she poured her heart out in prayer, desperate to know what she ought to do, and desperately certain that there were no choices left to her but to agree to Mr. Darnan's terms or spend the rest of her life in suffering. No, either way, she would spend the rest of her life in suffering. On top of the loss of her mother, this seemed far too much to bear. Dashing away tears, she came to rest against a tall brick building, heaving in a deep breath to stave away incipient weeping. The creaking of a sign caught her attention, and she looked upwards to see where she had found herself. Through the moisture in her eyes, the sign appeared rather fuzzed and illegible, but after a moment, she made out the words. Hartman and Foley Matrimonial Agency. The plan burst upon her with all the suddenness of the sun blooming through the clouds. She didn't wait to think. In the space between breaths, between heartbeats, she hurried into the open door, certain that the solution to her problems, to her future, awaited her inside. Chapter 2. The afternoon sun in Settlers Chance, Texas, lent a hazy golden glow to the streets of the little town that seemed more akin to an autumn day than one in early March. Pamela Hastings stepped down from the stagecoach, feeling cautious and tentative. She had rather hoped to be full of enthusiasm and hope, but after a journey that had taken more than 2 weeks, all told, hopping from train to stage to train and back again, she was too exhausted for any such strenuous emotions. And yet, the very thought of her long-awaited arrival brought with it the weeks of daydreaming about this very moment. Here at last, in Settler's Chance, the man she had agreed to marry would be waiting for her. Though she did not welcome the thought, she couldn't help the memories that washed over her. Her flight from the office of Mr. Darnan, her inspired stop at the matrimonial office, and the hurried agreement to the first match that was offered to her. Somehow, she had managed to arrange for passage west the very next morning, throwing her few remaining possessions into the worn-out old carpetbag she'd inherited from her mother and hustling to the station to catch the 8 o'clock train. At the time when Mr. Darnan would have been anticipating her arrival in his office to tender her agreement to his proposal, she was in fact breathing a sigh of relief as the train pulled out of the station, promptly on time. And here she was, for better or for worse, as though she had already spoken her vows. The man she was looking for, Mr. Charles Callahan, had not been described in detail by the matrimonial office. The agent, puzzling over the letter of application for a match, had shrugged one shoulder and told her, "Well, he's the local sheriff, my dear, so I suppose you'll know him at once." His age, height, hair and eye color, and any other telltale signs of his identity were subsumed into his occupation alone, allowing her imagination to run wild over the past few weeks. But Pamela supposed that he would be easy enough to pick out of the crowd. She was mistaken, but only because there was no crowd to choose from. Settler's Chance appeared to be a town roughly the size of her neighborhood of New York, with the marked difference that her neighborhood had consisted not just of a handful of streets, but also of hundreds of people, all rather crowded into flats and tenement buildings. The same could not be said of the Texas town. A handful of streets there were, indeed, but there was hardly anyone on them. The buildings surrounding the stagecoach stop were businesses, not homes, a mercantile, a saloon, a lumber mill, and at far end of the street she could just barely make out a sign that announced itself to belong to Miss Eunice Alsted's boarding house, clean rooms reasonably priced. What she could not find, no matter how hard she looked, was a fellow who looked as though he might be the local sheriff. She was the only one stepping down from the coach here in Settler's Chance. One bearded, dusty-shouldered old man did brush past her, grumbling to himself under his breath as he went, and leapt into the coach with a limber athleticism that surprised her. Perhaps, she thought, he was driven to it by his enthusiasm for leaving the town behind. But that was too negative, and too quickly. All she knew about the town was that it was very small, and that thus far it had failed to furnish anyone who was ready to meet and welcome her upon her arrival. The coachman hollered to the porter, Pamela was handed her carpetbag, and then the coach rolled off into the hazy afternoon, raising a cloud of dust around its wheels and the horses' hooves. Even this early in the year, Texas seemed to be a very dry place, she thought. She stood for a while longer, looking this way and that, wondering whether something had befallen Sheriff Callahan, to restrain him from his ability to meet her as he ought. Or could it be that he had simply forgotten? Or, worse, that something had indeed gone terribly wrong, and she was not intended to be met at all? Had she made the wrong decision in leaving so hastily? No, no, she soothed herself sternly. She had made the only decision that was available to her, and thus it could not be the wrong one. Whatever happened next, she had escaped from the clutches of Mr. Darnan and was free and clear here in Texas. Very free, it seemed, if no intended husband was ever going to show himself. At last, at a loss for what else to do, she could not stand to wait in inactivity any longer and struck out for the end of the street. Miss Eunice Alsted sounded very sensible and welcoming, she thought, and if she couldn't give her much information on where to find the local sheriff, then likely Pamela would need to inquire about a clean room reasonably priced, anyhow. With this goal in mind, she was set somewhat at ease, and thus it took her aback when the stranger came barreling out of the alleyway and collided with her in mid-stride. Oof! Oh! She took a step back hastily, too hastily, and stumbled over the unevenness of the split lumber walkway. The man took a quick step forward and reached out to steady her. His hand on her arm was not enough, and he scooped her up, holding her briefly in his embrace before setting her on her feet. Pamela's startled gaze was met with a very close encounter with the stranger, and her heart did a small somersault. Blue eyes, fringed with thick black lashes that made the color of them all the more vibrant and striking. A strong, noble face, perhaps not what many would term handsome but captivating all the same, even if the well-cut lips were set in a bit of a scowl. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, shading his face, and he wore a flannel coat even in the warmth of the afternoon, upon the breast of which something glinted with a silvery light. "Oh," Pamela said again, more softly this time, as she realized the truth of the matter. "Sheriff Callahan?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Do I know you, miss?" "Yes, no, I mean." One dark eyebrow raised, and he lifted his chin quizzically. Below the brim of his hat, she saw dark hair, rather long, peeking out. Black hair, black brows, and those striking blue eyes. It was a strange combination that seemed to make her feel a bit warm, more so than the simple effect of the afternoon sun. "Well, which is it, miss?" "I haven't got all day to stand around while you figure it out. I've got an appointment to keep." "An appointment?" she managed. He nodded. It wouldn't be to meet someone, would it?" "At the stagecoach?" His brows drew down over the bridge of his nose. "Now how did you—" He stopped, and she saw the realization dawning in his eyes. He looked her up and down. "Aha. Miss New York, I reckon." She fought the blush that threatened to bloom on her cheeks. "Miss Pamela Hastings," she said, rather more sharply than she intended. "Yes." "Arrived already, eh?" "As a matter of fact, I arrived over an hour ago." He glanced past her in the direction of the stagecoach. "Trust Matt to be on time for once in his life," he grumbled. "Oh, well, no harm done, eh? Miss Hastings." There was something about his manner that made her want to bristle, and whether it was in spite of his good looks or because of them, she was not certain. Either way, she drew herself up to her full 5'2" and lifted her chin. "No harm, perhaps, but it certainly was disconcerting, Sheriff Callahan, to arrive and find that I was not apparently expected. I've been thinking that all sorts of things had gone wrong. That perhaps the matrimonial agency had made a mistake." She paused, then continued ruthlessly, as nothing she was saying seemed to be making a difference to him anyhow. "That perhaps I had made a mistake." This caught his attention. He dropped his hand from her arm, where he had been supporting her all this time, and folded his arms, eyeing her for a moment. "Well, maybe so," he said at last, and her heart dropped to the soles of her boots. "Matter of fact, Miss Hastings, I'm afraid you're here under a bit of misapprehension." "What?" You did write for a bride, didn't you? To the Hartman and Foley Matrimonial Agency in New York?" "I did, at that," he acknowledged. "But the circumstances of it weren't exactly what you might call ideal." He sighed. "Halfway wish that Boone and the gang were here to explain it themselves, since they're at the root of it, but, well, the truth of the matter is that I wrote that letter on a dare, and that's the plain facts." She gaped at him. A dare?" "Uh-huh." Now that the truth was out, he seemed a bit more relaxed, even going so far as to grin at her wolfishly. "Now, I don't want you thinking badly of me, Miss Hastings, for I'll make it right one way or another. But the boys and I were talking and Boone pointed out that my whole life is the law, more or less. There's always something going on, in a town like Settlers Chance, and in a county like Cook County, Texas. Outlaws, bandits, cattle rustlers like Sam Riggs and his gang, we get all sorts. It's wild country, Miss Hastings. I reckon you'll be glad if you don't have to stay." Pamela opened her mouth but was unable to find the words she wanted to say. Glad if you don't have to stay. Did his "making it right" mean that he didn't intend to marry her at all, after the journey she had made to come here, after leaving everything she had ever known behind? And leaving Daniel Darnon behind, too, her mind whispered. It wasn't as though she could have stayed. But other arrangements could have been made. She could have waited a day or so, hiding out if need be, to find a match with a man who actually wanted her. To her shock, she realized suddenly that the words had found their own way out, and she had said this last out loud. She buried her face in her hands and burst into tears. She had a brief flash of Charles Callahan's face and was both grimly satisfied and bemused to see the shock and dismay that were evident on his striking features. The next thing she knew, his arm was around her, patting her warmly but ineffectually. There, Miss Hastings, I'm awful sorry, I didn't mean to make you cry. I reckon I ought to have broken the news a little differently. Hey, there, Charlie, women trouble, came a laughing voice from somewhere behind her. You just mind your own business, Fred, and go on with you, Callahan shouted back. I'm sorry, Miss Hastings, please don't cry. Come on, now, I'll tell you what I'll do. Let's step into the mercantile and get you a cup of lemonade, that'll fix you up. And then we'll talk it all out later, and you can tell me all about it. All about it, she must have let that slip, too, about hiding out from Daniel Darnon. Oh, the embarrassment was too much for a woman to stand. She lifted her head, shaking off her tears with determination and finding that somewhere in the process her curls had come loose again, spilling around her face and sticking to her wet cheeks. No, thank you, Sheriff Callahan, she managed, with only a small hiccup during the denial. I intended to seek out a room to rent at Miss Eunice Alsted's establishment. I understand that they are clean and reasonably priced. I am just tired out from the journey, that's all. Sure you are, he said encouragingly, patting her again. Come on, Miss Hastings, I'll walk you down there and make arrangements. Thank you, that won't be necessary. Oh, come on, let me, it's the least I can do. After all, you're here on my dime. She wanted badly to continue protesting, to deny his attempts to smooth things over, but she knew it was useless. After all, she hadn't any money to spend on a room. And by now he had tucked her arm through his, taking her bag with his free hand, and it was rather pleasant to be standing so close to him. She glanced sideways and upwards. No, perhaps he wasn't the traditional sort of handsome, but there was certainly something appealing about his looks. Something compelling. At least, she felt compelled. She allowed him, perforce, to conduct her down the street, making idle chit-chat to try and dispel the awkwardness between them. It was almost endearing, really, by now, thoroughly embarrassed by her outburst of emotion and feeling rather numb, she could allow him good grace for at least attempting to make her comfortable, whatever his other sins might have been. Miss Eunice Alsted turned out to be a friendly, motherly older woman who welcomed Pamela in with the clucking of a mother hen. She was directed towards a free room, both clean and reasonably priced, and ordered to change, wash up, have a lie down, and return downstairs for supper before bed. As she went, she heard Miss Eunice turning to Sheriff Callahan to make arrangements, but she no longer cared. The thought of sleeping was more compelling than the handsome sheriff himself. She turned at the top of the stairs, just long enough to catch sight of him, at almost the same moment that he turned his head to look up after her. Their eyes met, and she felt that strange little jolt of electricity run through her again. There was an apology in his eyes. Perhaps it was even genuine. She decided to put it all out of her mind and went to find the sweet oblivion of sleep on the clean, reasonably priced pillow. Chapter 3. The first thought in Pamela's mind upon waking up the next morning was of Sheriff Charles Callahan. The thought was, specifically, he wrote to the agency on a dare. She was already groaning before she even sat up in bed. For a long time, she sat with the covers still wrapped around her, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the little window in front of her. The room was on the second floor. She couldn't see much of the outside world from this vantage point, apart from the vivid blue of the sky. The same color as his eyes. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push the thought of Sheriff Callahan out of her mind and think instead of what she might do for her future. Despite the sharp turn that things seemed to have taken, she felt that she couldn't allow herself to be dissuaded from her certainty that she had made the right choice, the only choice. Things may be challenging, Pamela Hastings, she murmured to herself, but at least you aren't back in New York, engaged to Daniel Darnon. The thought of her home, left behind and lost forever, washed over her, bringing with it a surge of loneliness for her mother. If only Lydia Hastings was there. She would have known what to do. She would have set Sheriff Callahan straight. But Lydia had gone to her eternal rest, and her daughter knew that she must make this decision on her own. The first key, of course, was to determine what options were open to her. There were few enough possibilities. She had no money to her name, and she was only here in the boarding house because Sheriff Callahan had paid for it. She shook her head as her mind returned to thoughts of him. She pushed aside the covers to get up and start the day. The boarding house was quiet downstairs. She followed the smell of bacon into the dining hall, where she had eaten a quick supper the night before. She had been so exhausted by that point that her memories were hazy. She wasn't even entirely certain what she had eaten. The dining hall was small, the single long table seating 10 at maximum, but there was no one in it at the moment. She stepped past it and carried on into the kitchen, from which she could hear voices. The voices turned out to belong to Miss Eunice herself, who gave her a warm smile, and another older woman, standing at the wash basin with her arms plunged into the soap bubbles up to the elbow. "This is Aggie Porter," Miss Eunice introduced her. "Aggie, this is Miss Pamela Hastings, come to see us all the way from New York." "New York?" The other woman, who seemed to be the cook, or, at least, the mistress of the kitchen, turned a wide-eyed gaze on Pamela. "What on earth's brought you from New York all the way to a little corner of the world like Settler's Chance?" Pamela opened her mouth, then hesitated. What should she say? How to explain herself? But Miss Eunice evidently took it as a sign that she required assistance and willingly jumped into the fray. "You remember a few months ago when Boone Walker was tellin' everyone that he dared Charlie to write for a mail-order bride?" "I sure do." He got a chuckle out of that, and no mistake. "Well," said Miss Eunice, and gave a meaningful nod in Pamela's direction. "No," said Aggie, with a delighted laugh. "This is the bride in question, eh? Well, how about that? We're right pleased to have you with us, Miss Hastings, and I reckon Charlie is more pleased still." Pamela felt a faint blush warm her cheeks. "I'm not entirely certain about that," she said. "Oh, it's just his way," Miss Eunice said, with a wave of her hand. "He'll hem and haw about it, but you can trust our Charlie. He's new at the job, you know, and I guess those rustlers are runnin' him ragged, but old Sheriff Jones trained him well, and he's comin' along. Besides, he's a local boy. I've known him since he was nothing more than a sprout." She smiled at the thought. "We'd all be right glad to see him married, settled, and happy. Bein' the sheriff is just about all he's focused on for the past few years, and Boone Walker and the rest of those boys are all settled themselves, with families of their own. It's about time that Charlie caught up." Her casual dismissal of Sheriff Callahan's motivations, which had caused such distress to Pamela upon learning of them, seemed to shine a ray of sun over Pamela's day that was equally as bright as the actual sunshine outside. Perhaps it would be all right after all. If the sheriff was so well thought of by these two forthright ladies who had known him so long, then everything might turn out for the best. She was hardened enough to devote herself to a late breakfast, spread in front of her by the kindly Aggie. After partaking of bacon, eggs, porridge, and several cups of hot black coffee, she felt much more able to face the day, which was by now getting well along. It was fully 11 o'clock by the time she ventured out into the streets of town and began to explore. The sunlight was less hazy, at this time of day, and yet Settler's Chance still seemed to hold a golden glow. With a better outlook and attitude, she noticed that the weather-worn clapboards that made up every building were well kept despite their age, the businesses were tidy, and the few homes sprinkled here and there equally so. The response from passers-by to a stranger in their midst ran the gamut. She earned more than a few curious glances, a few outright stares, a friendly wave or two, and a round dozen folks who strode past her without looking, heads down and hands in their pockets. It was too soon, she decided, to judge Settler's Chance one way or another. And she certainly could not judge it based on the behavior of its sheriff. Between the buildings, she caught glimpses of the Texas prairie, spreading out on all sides around the town. The sky seemed to go on forever, the world had no limits, and she could almost believe that the sun could never set here, as there seemed to be no horizon for it to set upon. The only thing that linked Settler's Chance to any part of the outside world was the stagecoach, which ran through from one dusty trail leading east and carried on to another dusty trail leading west. She meandered past the stage stop and watched as the latest coach rumbled into view. This one was heading east, back the way she had come, just the day before. She hesitated just around the corner from it. It couldn't be the right thing, could it, to gather up her things and strike out back east? No, she decided. She had prayed a great deal about this decision, and it had all seemed to fall into place. She might not owe Sheriff Callahan very much, but she owed him at least that little, to let him prove himself one way or another. Besides, she hadn't the money for the fare. A young man rode past on a black horse. He called out, "Howdy, miss," and tipped his hat. She smiled without thinking and then realized afterwards that the voice had been familiar. He had been the one the day before who had teased Callahan about women trouble. She caught her breath, looking up at him, and he winked at her broadly. Coming along behind him, another man on a bay laughed out loud. The first man was Fred, she remembered. That was the name that Sheriff Callahan had used. The second, well, she would have laid even money that it was Boone Walker. Uncomfortably conscious of their eyes on her, turning in the saddle to watch even after they had gone past, she hurried onwards in the opposite direction. She had no real idea of where she was going. She'd never had a strong sense of direction to begin with, and this new terrain wasn't helping. Somewhere up here, she had the vague idea, if she turned to the right, she might find herself back on the street that led to Miss Eunice's boarding house. She reached the corner and turned right. The first sign she saw was the sign designating the building as the Settlers' Chance Jailhouse. The first face she saw was that of Charles Callahan. He was in shirt sleeves today, his jacket apparently abandoned, and his sleeves rolled up above the elbow. Still, the silver star winked from his chest. His brow was furrowed as he came out of the jailhouse in a rush, clearly occupied, but when she stopped a few feet in front of him, he looked up and his eyes met hers. They stood and stared at each other for a moment, wordless. "I'm late," Callahan said at last. "I can't stop to talk." It was such a brusque brush off, especially in the face of his rudeness the day before, that she couldn't help her little cry of protest. "Well, did I ask you to?" This arrested him in mid-step. He rocked back, shoving his hands in his pockets, and raised one black eyebrow at her. "Guess you didn't." "The more fool, me." Instead of being offended, he gave her one of his wolfish grins. "Miss Eunice been treatin' you all right?" "She's been very kind, thank you." "Good. I'm glad. I really did mean it when I said I was runnin' late. I'm not just tryin' to get rid of you, I promise." He touched his fingertips to the brim of his hat and moved on. Impulsively, as he passed her, she reached out and took hold of his sleeve. "Sheriff Callahan." He stopped in his tracks and turned to her. Blushing and heated, she let go of him and dropped her hands to twist together in front of her, feeling suddenly shy, and resenting him for it. But his voice was unexpectedly gentle. "What is it?" Sheriff, are you trying to get rid of me? Ought I to allow myself to be got rid of?" He tilted his head curiously. "How do you mean?" "I mean, if this was nothing but a bet, or a dare, or a joke, then perhaps it doesn't make any logical sense for me to stay put here in Settlers' Chance. You do owe me that much of an explanation, you know." "I know." His voice was still soft. It set her at ease and yet stirred something in her that made her nervous, all at once. "I fully intend to explain myself, Miss Hastings. As soon as I have the time. So, if you're a skin, whether you ought to just be on your way out of Settlers' Chance, well, it's your choice, of course. I won't stop you. But if you'll do me the favor of a little patience." From down the street, she heard horse hooves and shouting. Amidst the calling, she could distinctly make out Callahan's name. "It sounds as though you're in demand," she murmured. His eyes crinkled in the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, not that wolfish, teasing grin that made her feel rather irritated, but something soft and warm, matching his tone. "Reckon they can't get by without me. But we'll talk soon, Miss Hastings. You do what seems right to you. But I hope you stay." He was gone, then, disappearing around the corner of the jailhouse. A few seconds later he flew past her, leaping on the back of a black horse, already rolling into a steady gallop. She sighed, a sound that was full of a combination of irritation and admiration, as she watched him ride down the street to meet up with his fellows. There were a good 6 or 7 of them, deputies, she supposed. And now he was off to chase some bandits, or arrest some rustlers, or something along those lines. She really didn't know much about the sorts of dangers that lurked in a small Texas town like this one. But she had a feeling that she might be here long enough to find out. Chapter 4. With his promise in mind, she was at peace over the rest of the day, and the day after that, too. She caught sight of him the next afternoon, rushing off once more to put out some fire or other. There was plenty of time for wandering the few streets of Settlers' Chance, getting to know the lay of the land. Gradually, as folks got used to seeing her, many of them became emboldened enough to smile at her, and even go so far as to greet her. There was a strange sort of feeling in the town, and she remarked upon it to Miss Eunice and Aggie, the third day of her stay in the boarding house. The 2 older women glanced at each other and shook their heads gravely. "Well, I'll tell you the truth of the matter," Miss Eunice said. "Things have always been a little rough here in this little corner of Texas. There's just too much space." "I reckon it sends people batty," put in Aggie sagely. Miss Eunice chuckled. "Now, you know that's not exactly what I meant, Aggie. No, it's just that there's plenty of places to hide out with no fear of being caught, which makes it ideal for bandits and outlaws to carve a little clearing in the grasses and camp, away from the marshals and the rangers. Cook County can't have much more than a few thousand people, all told, but I reckon we could find homes for the whole population of America, if we needed to." "And then some," agreed Aggie with a nod. "So many crooks come here to hunker down when need be, and there are more than a few who decide to try their hands at the local folks, too. Why, just 2 years ago Mr. Hennessy's bank here in town was robbed at gunpoint. The mercantile's been held up a time or two, too. And the cattle rustlers, oh, they're the worst, the most persistent. Not a week goes by, it seems like, without one of the ranchers around town reporting that they've lost a few head of cattle, or that they chased someone off in the middle of the night, and we hear about folks all around the county, too. Texas is prime ranching country, you know." "I didn't know," Pamela said thoughtfully. "But it makes perfect sense to me, so I'm not surprised. The broad flat plains." "We prefer the term prairie," said Aggie, with mock severity. Miss Eunice chuckled at her and patted Pamela's hand. "Don't you mind her for a minute. Her son Arthur has a ranch himself, one of the biggest in Cook County. Aggie comes from an old ranching family. My husband did, too. Everyone has family or friends with a ranch, and I reckon the rustlers have been wearing on our nerves, all of us. Don't you worry, though, Miss Pamela. Your Charlie will sort them out in due time." She gave Pamela a firm nod, so clearly doing her best to reassure her that it couldn't help but touch Pamela's heart. She smiled back at her and put a hand on hers, receiving a squeeze in return. Though she had only been in residence for a few days, she had come to like Miss Eunice almost at once. The older woman wasn't the least bit like her own mother, and yet there was such a motherly quality about her that it almost felt as though they were related, somehow, after all. The reassurance did its work, for that day, and the next. But as the nights rolled through and the mornings came and went without any further discussion with Charles Callahan, Pamela's certainty about her situation began to ebb away like the tide. A few sightings here and there throughout the day, perhaps a hello or a wave, were certainly not enough to build a marriage on. And if he didn't explain himself and tell her exactly what he intended, dare or no dare, then she couldn't very well stay here forever, could she? Wouldn't she be a fool if she did? But perhaps she would be a fool if she didn't. What she needed, she decided one early morning as she lay awake, was to confront him point blank and demand an answer as to what he intended for their future, or, indeed, whether they had a future together at all. His concern over the gangs and rustlers around town was understandable, even admirable, but if he had no real intention of marrying her then he ought not to have written to the agency in the first place. Even if it was just for a dare. She slipped out the front door into the bluish light of dawn. The sun was not yet risen, but she could tell it was going to be another beautiful spring day. And a bit of a scorcher, if it was anything like the day before. She wondered how it would be here on the plains, or rather the prairies, when the summer arrived and there wasn't a lick of wind anywhere to stir the air. Would she be here to find out? She made her way to the jailhouse, hoping against hope that Sheriff Callahan might already be there, getting started for the day. But the door, though open, revealed no one behind it. The 2 jail cells were empty, the desk chair unsat in, and there wasn't a candle or oil lamp lit in the whole building. She was just turning to go, disappointed in her expectations, when he stepped around the corner, whistling. She jumped and cried out. Sheriff Callahan simply stared at her. He'd stopped whistling. Goodness. She clutched a hand to her chest and closed her eyes for a moment. Will you stop doing that? Doing what, Miss Hastings? You're always surprising me. He grinned. I'll tell you what, he said. I'll stop surprisin' you, if you stop bein' so easily surprised. After all, you're at my jailhouse. What can I do for you this fine mornin', so early that the coffee hasn't even perked? Recovering herself with an effort, she folded her arms and stood her ground. I would like to speak with you, Sheriff Callahan. I figured that, seein' as you're here, and all. I understood that you intended to speak with me, too. He sighed, relenting a little. Yes, he said. I sure did. Trouble is, Miss Hastings, what with one thing and another, I just haven't had the time. You're still comfortable at Miss Eunice's place? She's feed in you well and all? If she needs me to make some other arrangements. Miss Eunice has been the soul of friendliness, she assured him. And I feel that I'm beginning to get to know others in town, too. Just about everyone, in fact, except for their sheriff. Aha. Well. He shoved his hands in his pockets. As I said. I haven't had the time. Perhaps you could make the time, she suggested, hearing a hint of acidity in her tone but feeling that he deserved it, if not even more. After all, I'm at a loss for what my status is here, really. What status would you like? I just want to know where we stand. Right in front of the jailhouse, he said reasonably. She let out a little huff of protest. Sheriff Callahan, all I need to know is whether you intend to pursue our engagement or not. I told you I did, didn't I? She gaped at him. Did you? No. Surely not, I'd think I would remember. I told you, he said patiently, that I wanted you to stay. I also told you it was your choice whether you did or not. Far as I can tell, that's a clear indication of my interest. It's true, Miss Hastings, that I wrote to that matrimonial agency on a dare. And when I came to collect you at the station, I intended to tell you that it might be best if we went our separate ways. I was going to buy your ticket back to New York, or wherever you wanted to go. But the fact is, Miss Hastings, you're the prettiest girl I've ever seen, and there's a spark in you that I like. And I might not mind being married after all, regardless of how it came about. So, if you've a mind to wait it out and see which way we leap, that's all gold to me. But I can't take time from chasin' down varmints and rustlers just to talk about the softer side of life, so it's goin' to take a little time. His eyes bored into hers, intense and blue as the skies above. Understand? It was the longest speech she'd ever heard from him, and somehow both the most attractive and the most infuriating at the same time. She realized she was still gaping and closed her mouth abruptly. I suppose I do, she managed faintly. You might want to marry me, but you're not sure. That's about the size of it. And I've got to wait until I'm called for to find out. Well, I guess I wouldn't have put it quite that way, but... And for all that, she went on, her tone growing in spirit and strength, the only reason you're even considering it is because you think I'm pretty. Well... That's the most offensive thing I've ever heard. Now it was his turn to gape. She understood why. Her words had surprised her, too, but they were true all the same. And I suppose, she went on, lifting her chin, that I can't make you any more promises than you can make me, Sheriff Callahan, for I'm not entirely sure that I want to marry you anyhow. She stalked past him, back in the direction of the boarding house. She was certain that he was watching after her, though she didn't look back, and he said nothing further, but she hadn't reached the end of the block before she heard the door to the jailhouse close. It had the sound of finality. Chapter 5. Now, Miss Pamela, said Miss Eunice, her voice soft and yet strong, feeling like a warm blanket around Pamela's shoulders. "You know that I've come to love you like a daughter, even in the short time you've been here in Settler's Chance, and I only want what's best for you. But I don't want to see you make a decision too fast, especially not one that you might regret in the end." Her soft tones soothed Pamela's wounded spirit. So, too, did the strong coffee that had been pressed upon her as soon as she entered the kitchen, clearly in distress. Miss Eunice was as good as a tonic. Already she felt better, having spilled the story out to the older woman. "I don't either," she said, dabbing at her damp eyes with her handkerchief. "But I don't know what to do. He could take a little time to get to know me, couldn't he? It isn't fair of him to simply expect me to hang around waiting, without knowing whether I might be waiting forever, and without even knowing what I'm waiting for." "Sure, it isn't," Miss Eunice said, patting her hand comfortingly. "No one would argue that it is. I reckon even Charlie himself knows that it's a tall order to ask of you. But he's nothing but truthful. He won't tell you that he's interested in marrying you if he isn't." Pamela couldn't help herself. "Ha," she cried. "But it was all a lie, wasn't it, Miss Eunice? He only wrote the letter to the matrimonial agency because that Mr. Boone, whoever he is, dared him." "A dare it might well have been, and it was foolish of Boone Walker to push Charlie that far," Miss Eunice said. "But Charlie wouldn't have done it if he wasn't willing to at least consider marriage, and after all, that's what the match from the matrimonial agency is, isn't it? An engagement, for the purposes of seeing whether the two of you are a good match or not. The agency wouldn't strike you for deciding that Charlie wasn't what you wanted, would they?" I suppose not." "Then why should any different be expected of Charlie?" Miss Eunice said reasonably. "After all, he told you as soon as you arrived what the truth of the matter was. And perhaps if you two had corresponded at all, instead of accepting the match and rushing out here at once, he would have made that clear before you went through all that trouble." Pamela shook her head and sighed. "I'm sure you're right, Miss Eunice, and yet, it still feels as though I ought to be able to expect more of him. I only rushed out here because I had to, you know. It wasn't as though I'd been dreaming of marrying some stranger in Texas." With a little prodding from Miss Eunice, and another cup of very good coffee, Pamela laid bare the story of Mr. Daniel Darnan, his crooked lending, and his proposed settlement of her debt. Miss Eunice listened with shock on her face, adding in headshakes and a cluck of her tongue at the appropriate moments. "Well, you're certainly better off without him," she declared. "I dare say you made the right decision, Miss Pamela. You're safe here, at least." "Well, safe from that fellow, and Charlie will do his level best to keep you safe from any other sort of harm, I'll stake my life on it. If Charlie Callahan tells you that he finds you appealing, my dear, that's as good as a declaration of true love from another man." Pamela smiled, though she could feel a blush coming on. "I wish I felt I could believe it," she said. Miss Eunice squeezed her hand. "Believe it," she said. "And give him a little time, if you've a mind to. Goodness knows, if you need something to occupy your time, I sure could use a little help around here, and Mr. Brooks at the Mercantile has been looking for a helper, too." Though her heart was still undecided, Pamela agreed to these suggestions readily enough. There was no harm in waiting around a little longer. After all, it wasn't as though she had anywhere to go. It seemed as though she blinked, and 2 weeks had gone by. Spring was in full swing at last, and the afternoons were downright hot, though still clear-aired and delightful. She enjoyed the weather, the freshness in the mornings and the long cooling down at twilight. She came to love the way the shadows crept themselves longer and longer as the sun neared the invisible horizon, slipping between the lip of the land and the edge of the sky and disappearing like a great winking eye drooping closed. Mr. Brooks at the Mercantile was grateful for an extra pair of hands. She took to spending afternoons there, sweeping up and organizing, and even driving short distances in the cart to make deliveries around town. Another week went by, with only a handful of sightings of the local sheriff, and no conversation, not even a greeting. But she was certain, each time she saw him, that his gaze lingered on her with some sort of significance. Just what that significance might have been, however, she could not say. April was midway through when the sound of shots alarmed her one afternoon, startling her from her reverie in Miss Eunice's sitting room. She sat up straight. Miss Eunice rose from her chair, a keen listening look on her face. "Those are awful close," she murmured. Pamela had just begun to say, what do you think?" when the door burst open and a small knot of people rushed in. At first it felt like a crowd, but as things sorted themselves out and Pamela recognized some of them, she realized that there were no more than 5, all of them causing a commotion that could have easily belonged to more than twice that number. One young boy was in the lead, with 2 men right behind him, carrying a third between them. He hung suspended by their arms, with no apparent strength of his own, his head down. For a brief, blinding moment Pamela thought he was dead. The hat was the same that Sheriff Callahan wore, and her heart seized with the thought that he was lost to her forever. Then Callahan himself strode in, his handsome face tense, and she melted back down into her chair, overwhelmed with a strange feeling of relief. "Miss Eunice," he said, running a hand through his shaggy dark hair. His head, it turned out, was bare, as he had lost his own hat at some point in the recent escapade. "Doc Parrish is gone on a call, and Fred here has a shot through the shoulder. It went through clean out the other side, so there's no need to dig for a bullet. Would you nurse him until he stops bleedin' all over creation?" Miss Eunice said not a word but laid her knitting down and got to her feet. She advanced on the fellow who was being supported by the others and lifted his head. It took Pamela a few glances to recognize the man who had smiled at her from horseback, the day after her arrival. "Take him upstairs," Miss Eunice said. "The room on the far left of the hall. I'll follow directly. For heaven's sake don't let him bleed on my good coverlet. Fetch a towel, Aggie, better make that 3 or 4. Miss Pamela, would you go to the hall closet and find the black bag there? Bring it up as soon as you do." She was already rolling her sleeves up as she left, and Pamela knew that she must be going to wash up. She had caught just a glimpse of the wound in Fred's shoulder, and knew with a sickened feeling in the pit of her stomach that it must be sewn or he would die from loss of blood. The next hour was very exciting, and very unpleasant. Her stomach churned at the sight of the bullet hole, and she would have fled the room if not for 2 things. One was Miss Eunice herself, her calm, kind, motherly persona subsumed by a businesslike nurse, ordering Pamela and Aggie to fetch item after item, reassuring Fred himself that he would be just fine if he would lie still. One of the items Pamela was sent to find in the kitchen was a dark brown bottle. From the smell of it when the cork was removed, she suspected it was whiskey. Miss Eunice gave the wounded man a healthy swig from the bottle before she began to stitch. The other thing that kept Pamela from running away was the presence of Sheriff Charles Callahan, standing with his back to the wall and his eyes rather haunted, watching everything as closely as though he were going to reenact it step by step. It was the look on his face that told Pamela just how dangerous things had really been. But, at last, the wound was sewn shut, the bleeding stopped, the shoulder bandaged, and the wounded man sleeping off the pain under the influence of another few swigs of liquor. Miss Eunice dismissed Pamela and Aggie, announcing that she would sit with him for a time to make sure that he would sleep for the rest of the night. When Callahan made a movement towards the chair, she turned on him and dismissed him in precisely the same tone of voice. "Go on with you, Sheriff," she said. "I reckon you're in need of a good rest, yourself. Take a glass of whiskey. Consider it prescribed, for medicinal purposes." Callahan shook his head, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "I reckon I won't need it," he said. "I'll be asleep as soon as my head hits the pillow. Call for me if anything changes, Miss Eunice." She nodded. "I surely will." Pamela followed Aggie out into the hallway and down the stairs, painfully aware of the sheriff following her. His tread was slow and heavy, and he did not speak. She felt her own breath coming rather roughly, her nerves beginning to flare. If he didn't say something, she thought, she would be forced to. They hadn't spoken since that early morning when she had accosted him in front of the jailhouse. She hadn't told him why she was still there in Settler's Chance, and he hadn't asked. She was suddenly grateful for that, for she wasn't sure she knew the answer herself. She turned to follow Aggie towards the kitchen, and the sound of Callahan's voice arrested her. "Miss Pamela." She turned to him, biting her lip, and met his gaze, though it took more courage than she had known she possessed. He nodded his bared head to her, with an undeniable look of respect, and was that gratitude? It was. "Thank you for your help," he said. "I figured Miss Eunice would know what to do, but I reckon she would have found it a great deal more difficult if not for you. You got a calm head in an emergency." She was gladder than ever that she hadn't rushed from the room to vomit in the hallway, as she had feared she might once or twice during the proceedings. She took a deep breath and nodded back. "You are very welcome, Sheriff Callahan. And your deputy, too. Fred's his name. Fred Beauregard. He's Miss Eunice's nephew. Just about the only family she's got left, I reckon." Pamela felt her face grow still and pale. How well Miss Eunice must know him, how dearly she must love him, and yet Pamela never would have suspected from the calm, collected way in which she had carried on. She shook her head. "I admire her more and more with every passing day," she said. "I'm glad to know her, and glad that I came here to Settler's Chance, for that, if nothing else." His eyes were fixed on hers, and she was almost certain that, mixed in with the exhaustion, she saw a sadness there. He bowed his head without speaking again, turned, and went out into the evening. The sun had only just set, she realized with a faint sense of shock. It seemed ludicrous, for surely entire days had passed while she worked under Miss Eunice's direction. But it had only been a matter of a few hours since the little crowd of men had burst through her front door. And now she felt she had begun to understand the dangers that faced the people of Settler's Chance, and their sheriff. Chapter 6. Now more than ever, the little town of Settler's Chance seemed to be under a strain. Piece by piece, the truth of the story leaked out into the public gossip. Sheriff Callahan had led his deputies into an ambush. The commenters were mixed as to reactions. Some said that he could never have anticipated it, while others declared outright and without room for argument that old Sheriff Jones would never have done anything so foolish as to ride after a gang like the Gold Creek Five without at least twice as much backup in his own posse. Some thought it was brave, others labeled it foolhardy. Still others pointed out that the deputies had known full well what they were getting into, and anything that occurred could not be blamed on Charles Callahan, but more than a handful of the townsfolk, riled up against Callahan, retorted to these objections that the real answer as to who was responsible would have to come from Fred Beauregard, when he was well enough to talk. For Pamela's part, her emotions were confused, to say the least. She still held a bit of a grudge against Callahan. After all, it had now been well over a month since her arrival, and the only true conversation they'd had about their supposed engagement had been initiated by her and left both frustrated. But at the same time, as her understanding of the dangerous situation the sheriff and his posse found themselves in gradually grew, she felt she was beginning to comprehend just what he had meant by telling her that he hadn't the time to think of other things. He had only been the sheriff for a short while, after the retirement of the previous sheriff who had trained him well. It must feel as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. She could understand the feeling, she thought wryly as she straightened up from her current task at the mercantile and stretched her back. She cast a quick glance around and noted that no one seemed to be looking. It was early in the morning yet, and Mr. Brooks' fine establishment had only a few customers, sprinkled in amongst the shelves. The bell above the door tinkled as someone else entered, but she could not see who it was. Mr. Brooks himself was poring over the ledgers behind the counter. He'd set her the task of unloading a few boxes of goods and setting them where they belonged on the shelves, but she had taken it upon herself to carry out a few more to work on. Currently she was unloading bags of flour and sugar, 20 pounds each. The job was repetitive and a bit mind-numbing, but she didn't mind that. In fact, numbing her mind a little felt like a relief from the constant strain of trying to ascertain just how she truly felt about the whole situation, and especially Charles Callahan. No one was looking. She swung her arms side to side and stretched them up above her head, going up on the tiptoes of her boots to try and release the tension in her back and neck, her bodice tightening and stretching over her chest and shoulders. Lifting the heavy boxes was certainly proving a trial to her strength. At the same time, though, she relished the challenge, a challenge she could throw herself into, without fearing the consequences. She heard Mr. Brooks stir and murmur, "Well, hey there, Sheriff." Her heart skipped a beat or two, and she swiftly dropped her arms and spun around. As she had feared, Charles Callahan stood at the end of the aisle, eyeing her thoughtfully. A blush overtook her, and she folded her arms hastily, but his only response was an amused smile. "Good morning, Alf. What are you up to today, Sheriff?" Mr. Brooks came around the counter and joined them in the aisle, smiling at the younger man. "Not about to bake a cake, are you? Hadn't planned on it, I guess." Mind you, my wife's been thinkin' she ought to take a cake out to the Laramie place, or somethin', anyhow. After how they got struck yesterday. I hear they lost about half their herd." His tone was invitational, curious and questioning. The gossip had spread like wildfire around town. In a place the size of Settlers' Chance, it was inevitable. But the sheriff of Cook County was surely the authority who could state what had truly happened, if he had a mind to. Evidently, he did not. The teasing gleam died out in Callahan's eyes, and he turned abruptly away from Pamela. "It was very unfortunate," he said. "Unfortunate," said a voice from the next aisle over. A middle-aged woman stepped around the corner. Pamela recognized her as Dee Dee Myers, a well-known face in the mercantile who seemed to have perpetually just bitten into a lemon. She frowned at the sheriff, one hand on her hips, the other holding her shopping basket up as though it were a shield. "I suppose that's one word for it. And Laramie said that young Tom will never be the same." Pamela's eyes darted back to the sheriff, in time to see his jaw tighten. "I reckon he'll heal," he said. "A youngster like that, a broken leg won't even slow him down." "But it wouldn't have happened if you'd been on the watch, as you ought to have been," Mrs. Myers argued. "They've fought off rustlers regular, like clockwork, every week, and John Laramie knew that they were comin' back after that last one. They poisoned his dogs to keep Em from soundin' the alarm. It was clear as day what they were plannin'. You ought to have done more to protect Em. You ought to be protectin' all of us. Sheriff Jones would never have allowed things to get in such a state." There was a breathless hush in the mercantile. Pamela was painfully aware that everyone in the building was watching and waiting to see what might happen next. She wondered about it herself. Though she had seen the sheriff in a few tight spots, she had never seen him react to a situation like this. With his rather unpredictable personality, she could almost expect anger, volatility, but instead, his voice grew soft and mild. "I surely do regret what happened to Tom," he said. "And the loss of Mr. Laramie's herd. The word is out, I reckon, that Cook County is an easy mark. I'm only one man, and there are only a handful of deputies, and whoever I can convince to join the posse. I won't say that I'm entirely at fault, but I regret it all the same, and I aim to do better." "And what, precisely, are you doing about it?" Mrs. Myers demanded. "Called in the Rangers, 4-1, Callahan said. They're on their way. We're going to go in and root these rustlers out once and for all." He tipped his hat to Mrs. Myers, nodded to Mr. Brooks, and turned to go. The sour old woman called after him, "Just as you ought to have done, months ago, Charlie Callahan. If you'd not been so stubborn." "Well, he's doing it now, isn't he?" It wasn't until the three others turned to look back at her that Pamela realized that the words had come from her own mouth. She blushed, gulped, and continued. There was no backing down, not now. "He's doing it now," she repeated, more softly this time, but determined all the same to defend him. "He's put himself in danger time and time again, yes, that is his job and his responsibility, but it doesn't take away the importance of it. He's done what he can, and now that it is beyond him, he's calling for the help he needs. We ought to support him, Mrs. Myers, don't you think? It's a frightening job, and a dangerous one. Every day he must be risking his life for the people of Settlers' Chance." Her eyes found his, though it was hard to force them to. He looked at her with something like compassion, tinged at the edges with, was that admiration? Gratitude? She couldn't think about it too hard, or she would derail herself entirely. She looked back to Dee Dee Myers and finished, triumphantly. "The least we can do is be his backup here at home, since we can't fight alongside him." Mrs. Myers gave a little sniff in response, and turned back to her shopping, shaking her head. The rest of the customers, too, moved back to their tasks, murmuring here and there amongst themselves. In the quiet that followed Pamela's unexpected speech, she sought out Callahan's gaze again. He nodded, touching his fingertips to the brim of his hat, and then he was gone. Leaving her behind, more confused than ever. And more than a bit annoyed, if truth be told. She turned back to her labors, chastising herself. What was all that about? There she was, leaping in to defend a man who had not asked her for defense. He hadn't asked her for anything. Why, then, did she feel this strange bond of loyalty to him? Why, what had he done to show any loyalty to her? She was still railing at herself in her mind when Mr. Brooks returned to her side. "Now, Miss Pamela, that's an awful heavy load for you to carry. Goodness, 20 pounds per bag. Your back must be atchin' something terrible." She stood and stretched again, wiping her forehead with the back of her sleeve. Somehow during her internal argument with herself, she had managed to finish each box that needed to be put away. "It is, a bit," she admitted. Mr. Brooks shook his head and clucked his tongue. "I know," he said suddenly. "I'll give you a nice easy task instead. I've got several deliveries to be made to ranches just outside of town. It's a beautiful day, and that will give you a little rest. Can you drive the wagon all right?" "Fine, just fine. Let me load 'em up for you, Miss Pamela, and I'll write out the directions. Oh, you'll enjoy the rest of the day, I'm sure. It's too beautiful to waste indoors." As she followed her employer towards the stock room, Pamela couldn't help but wonder. Would driving out to make deliveries help the pain in her back? And more importantly, would it distract her at last from the thought of the sheriff of Settlers' Chance, standing stalwart against both the ruffians that threatened the town and the townsfolk who didn't know a good thing when they had it? Chapter 7. It was, indeed, a beautiful day as Pamela headed out into the great wide world of Cook County, Texas. As confused as her emotions were, she couldn't help but give herself over to the beauty that surrounded her. For once, it was not unseasonably hot, at least, to her mind, it had seemed unseasonably hot, but perhaps such high temperatures were de rigueur for a Texas spring, and there was a faint breeze blowing that provided a refreshing counterpoint to the strong sunshine. Off in the distance, near where she knew the horizon must be, she could make out a small cloud. From the insight of Miss Eunice, readily shared, she knew that this was a dry country, with rainstorms few and far between. The thought of experiencing one such rarity filled her with a pleasurable anticipation. Mr. Brooks' directions were sparse, but then there were few twists and turns to be taken in this broad, flat land. She found the Henderson farm readily enough, after just a few minutes' drive. The Patricks weren't far beyond that. She fell into a routine, locate the place where the delivery belonged, spend a few moments chatting with the family who lived there, allow one of the men of the family to unload their parcels and boxes, and be guided towards the next place, moving on after half an hour or so. It was a bit different from the local deliveries she had been making in Settlers' Chance, but she quickly decided that she preferred this, overall. It was good to get out of town and see more of the countryside. Perhaps that was what she had been needing all along. She couldn't go anywhere in Settlers' Chance without thinking of Charles Callahan and their confusing relationship. Folks out here seemed to have a good opinion of the local sheriff, she was glad to find, at least, once they realized who she was, none of them were in a hurry to say anything negative about him. They seemed to understand the enormity of the task that faced him, as just one man with a handful of willing deputies. What was more, most of the families who owned ranches and farms took their own safety and security very seriously, with guns at the ready and dogs whining anxiously to be let out of their kennels to investigate the newcomer. As the day came to a close, she looked at her list and found that she had only one final delivery to be made. It was the furthest away from town, of course. She had steadily been working her way farther and farther out into the countryside, with the landscape growing ever lonelier and emptier as she went. Bar K was the name of the ranch, Henry Potts was the name of the rancher. She gathered up the reins in both hands and urged the horses on, noting as she went that the faraway clouds she had seen earlier were now almost upon her. Well, the timing was just about right, for she would be done with the delivery and on her way home before any potential storm arrived. And in the meantime, it would make for a beautiful sunset. As she rolled up into the yard of the Bar K, she wondered whether she might not have to simply unload the delivery herself and leave it on the porch. It appeared abandoned. She could see the barn from where she sat, and between house and outbuildings there wasn't a hint of movement. "Hello? Is anyone home?" A long pause, and then the door to the house creaked open. A man came out, bareheaded, one hand on his hip, on his pistol, she realized, for he wore a holster and appeared ready for action at the slightest hint of a threat. But this fit in with the pattern set at the other homes she had visited, she told herself, even if it did seem a bit presumptive. Perhaps he lived alone and had to be more cautious. "Mr. Potts," she said. Another long pause, and then he stepped down from the veranda. In the dying sunlight of the day, she saw that his eyes were a pale, weak blue, and his hair so sandy as to be almost the same color of his skin. He ventured towards her. "Who are you?" She didn't much care for his manners, but, after all, she was only there to make a delivery, not to befriend him. "Mr. Brooks sent me with your parcels," she said, fixing a smile on her face. "My name is Pamela Hastings. Don't recognize your face." "Oh, I'm not from around here, Mr. Potts. I'm new to the area, I suppose you could say." The silence that this garnered made her nervous, and she plunged on in needless explanation. "I'm from New York, you see. I was matched with your local sheriff, Charles Callahan, and we're engaged to be married." It wasn't entirely true, but neither was it entirely untrue, either. It still felt like a lie as she said it, and yet it called for a yearning in her heart that she was afraid to try and understand. If nothing else, she reasoned, perhaps the mention of the sheriff's name would cause this man to become more friendly or at least drop his hand from his pistol. If she had hoped for a reaction to Callahan's name, a reaction was precisely what she got. He didn't drop his hand, but a small smile did start to spread across his face. "Callahan's bride, eh?" "Yes." It still felt wrong, and yet so right. "Well, how about that?" He chuckled and turned his head, calling over his shoulder. "Come on out, men. We've got a prize on our hands." Something was dreadfully wrong, she knew it at once. Perhaps she had known it all along and simply had not been able to admit it to herself. The hair on the back of her neck was standing on end. A motley handful of men followed in the wake of the first, some coming from the gaping front door of the house, a few from around the corner. They converged upon her, and she gathered up the reins as the horses started nervously. "Mr. Potts, I don't understand." "I reckon I could hardly expect you to," said the first man. "You see, I ain't Mr. Potts." He took his pistol from the holster and leveled it at her. "I'm Samuel Riggs, as a matter of fact. Let those reins go, Miss Hastings, and let Johnny here help you down. You're goin' to stay with us a while, until we get that sheriff of yours right where we want him." As Pamela stepped down from the wagon, her heart racing, she realized where she had heard that name before. Weeks ago, when she had first arrived, when she had confronted Callahan that morning in front of the jailhouse, he had spoken that name as one of the rustlers he was warring against. "It's wild country, Miss Hastings. I reckon you'll be glad if you don't have to stay." But she did have to stay. The pistol insisted on it. From the looks of things, she wasn't going anywhere for a very long time. As she was led into the house, the storm burst overhead at last. Chapter 8. "What do you intend to do with me?" It was the first sentence she had been allowed to speak for hours. She wasn't at all certain how long it had been. They had tied her hands together in front of her, then gagged her with a handkerchief, none too clean, she was displeased but not surprised to find. She had been led to a bed in the little bedroom at the back of the house, and after a moment of wild and uncertain fear, had been left blessedly alone. The night passed in a crawl, with no sound other than the murmurs and occasional raucous laugh from the other room, and the constant drumming of the drenching rain. It was just beginning to grow light around the edges of the high window when the door opened, and she was roughly pulled out into the main room of the house once more. She wasn't sure whether she should be grateful or fearful that only Sam Riggs himself was present. He gave her a grin that she did not like at all. "Well, Miss Hastings, you've already proven useful. Johnny took a note to your beloved sheriff, and we're expecting a response any moment now." She gaped at him. "A response? A note? What on earth are you talking about? What did you tell him?" "Oh, nothin' but the truth," Riggs assured her. "That we had his little wifey in our clutches, and that if he didn't sit tight over the next few days while my men and I complete our operation, he'll never see you again." She gulped involuntarily, and he laughed. "Now, I didn't specify exactly what we planned to do, mind you. Better to let him imagine it for himself, don't you think? He leaned closer to her and whispered, though there was no one else to hear. Myself, I reckon we ought to take you along with us when we leave to drive the herds out of Cook County forever. You're awful pretty, even if you are a little scrawny, and I figure you and I could learn to get along if we put our minds to it. She turned her head away from him and he stepped back, chuckling to himself. He went to the window, lifting the curtain and gazing out. If I could only see the look on Callahan's face when he finds out that you're here with me, he said longingly, and sighed. That would make it all just about perfect. But I reckon a man can't have everything, or he might well die of happiness. He turned back, grinning at her. You're new in the area, miss, you said it yourself, so you don't know about the feud that's gone on between me and Callahan. I've done my little bit, striking here and there, and he's been too distracted with all the other varmints in Cook County to do much about it, but he's hit home once or twice. Well, I'm tired of this place, mighty tired, and as soon as I get what I want out of it, I'll be gone for good. You, Miss Hastings, you're the key to it all. He watched her almost hungrily for a moment, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying out. If he should step toward her, what would she do? Kick and scream and everything she could, but would it be enough? Her hands were still bound, after all. But he didn't step toward her. Instead, he moved towards the door. You just sit there lookin' pretty, he advised her. Johnny'll be back soon enough with word from the sheriff, and as soon as dark falls, we'll be about our business. If we pull this off as I've planned, we'll ride out of here tomorrow morning with half the cattle and settlers' chance, and not a single lawman on our tail. He chuckled again as the door slammed behind him, leaving her alone to stare wide-eyed at the growing light out the window and wonder what the rest of the day held. She found that she could get up and walk about without too much discomfort. Everything with a sharp edge had been removed from the kitchen, however, and try though she might, she could not unbind her hands. The door was locked, of course, and the windows barred. They were too small to crawl out of, anyhow, even for someone of her minute stature. Forced to remain inside, with nothing to do and no way to warn Callahan, she railed against the gang and especially against Sam Riggs. But what could she do about it? Nothing. Nothing, but wait and see. It only made sense for the gang to wait until nightfall, sheriff or no sheriff. Once the word was given, they would ride out, likely leaving her there. She wondered what had happened to the owner of this ranch house, Henry Potts, and then decided it was best to assume that he was part of the gang himself. There was no evidence that he had been attacked and harmed, at least none that she could see. Perhaps Riggs and his crew had been using this home as a hideout with his full cooperation. Whatever the case, it didn't matter a bit, for by the next day they would be gone for good. As the sun passed high overhead and began to approach the far horizon, she gave into a certain amount of despair. It was understandable, she thought, in the circumstances. Either Callahan would ignore their demands and ride out to capture them as they attacked the farms, regardless of the danger to Pamela, or he would bow to their orders, and she would never see him again. Was that really what it came down to, whether he had any true feelings for her or not? What a terrible way to find out. She had resigned herself to waiting it out and was anticipating the coming sunset when she heard the sound of shots in the distance. In a split second, she was on her feet, her mind racing. Was it rescue? No, it couldn't be. They didn't know where she was, did they? But suppose that the gang had turned on itself. Suppose that some faction was fighting for dominance against Sam Riggs? Suppose. Shots again, bullets being fired, closely enough that she could hear them whistling through the air. Cries and shouts and screams, threats and curses. She ran to the door and banged her joined, bound fists against it, crying out loud. Charlie. Charlie. Why it was that his name came from her lips, she could not be certain. There was no guarantee that he was the one who led the attack. And yet, when the door burst open and she fell forward into his waiting arms, she felt as though she had known it all along. He held her for only a second, then set her back, grinning that wolfish grin. There you go again, he said, throwing yourself at me. She fought for breath, feeling dazed. If you wouldn't keep surprising me like this. He laughed and tucked her under his arm, shepherding her out of the house. As they went, he untied the rope around her wrists, freeing her hands, and she immediately wrapped one arm around his waist, clinging to him desperately. The firefight was still going on, though on one side of the house. She ducked her head at the sound of a bullet, too close by for her comfort. What on earth? I'll explain later, he assured her. Come on, then, up you go. She found herself boosted unceremoniously onto the back of his black horse. Scarcely a breath later, he was up behind her, one strong arm wrapping around her waist and holding her steady. He urged the horse forward with an unheard word and a tap of his heels, and then they were moving quickly through the golden light of late afternoon, leaving the bullets and the danger behind them, just the two of them. They had left the noise of the battle far behind when they reached a wagon that was waiting for them. Miss Eunice was at the reins, and she let out a loud exclamation of delight when they rode into view. Pamela was lifted effortlessly from her seat and handed over to the older woman, who threw her arms about her and held her close as though she intended never to let go. Pamela couldn't help but return the gesture, embracing Miss Eunice in return. It felt as though it was her mother's loving arms around her. She closed her eyes tightly for a moment, feeling the emotion of the past day threatened to overwhelm her, but the hurried conversation between Callahan and Miss Eunice made her sit up and take notice. All right to get back? We'll be fine, Charlie. How goes it? She looked at him just in time to see that wolfish grin, his eyes glinting in the brilliant ochre light of the sunset. I reckon we'll teach Em a thing or two this time, he said. His eyes darted to Pamela, and she felt her heart speed up in her chest. Everything in her longed to reach out to him, to draw him close into an embrace, but she kept her hands and arms where they were. Sheriff Callahan. I'll be back, he told her, and she knew it was a promise. And then, we'll talk, you and me. He gave a short, wry laugh. If you're finally ready. Then he was off again, riding back the way they had come, back towards the fray, a black silhouette against the never-ending, limitless vastness of the Texas sunset. Chapter 9. Sip your coffee, dear. Pamela took a deep breath, inhaling the fragrant steam from the mug in her hands. It was so wonderfully comforting to be back here in the little dining room of Miss Eunice's boarding house, with its clean rooms and reasonable prices. She didn't realize that she had said it aloud until Miss Eunice chuckled, taking a seat beside her with her own coffee mug at the ready. You may call it that, she said, but your eyes say that you're home. Pamela couldn't help but smile at her. Yes, she said. I suppose that's right. It feels right, anyhow. I'm home. She took a sip and made a wry face. This tastes. A little dash of whiskey for medicinal purposes never hurt anybody, Miss Eunice said, sipping her own doctored coffee demurely. And if anyone deserves it, it's you, 24 hours in the clutches of a wretch and a ruffian like Sam Riggs. However, did you keep the faith, my dear? Pamela shook her head. I'm not entirely certain that I did, not with any constancy, at least. I couldn't think of what might happen. It sounded as though they had Sheriff Callahan's hands tied, just as they had mine. You might think so, but our Charlie is brighter than they give him credit for, and more determined, too. I dare say he might not have ridden into the fray in just quite such a heroic manner if it hadn't been for you, but, well, let's let him address that, when he returns. She chuckled, and the warm, rich sound aroused Pamela's curiosity and set her heart to beating more swiftly. What do you mean? He gathered a posse not 5 minutes after that scoundrel Johnny O'Dia left him. Miss Eunice went on as though she had not spoken. Everyone was willing enough, even down to our Fred. Her smile was fond as she spoke of her nephew. They knew that time was of the essence, and yet they had to allow enough time to pass for the gang to get themselves into position, thinking that they had the all clear. As it was, they surprised half of them still at old Mr. Potts' ranch. The mention of his name sparked her attention, and Pamela sat up straight. What happened to him? Mr. Potts, I mean. Miss Eunice smiled at her, the same sort of fondness that she had shown for her nephew Fred shining in her eyes. It's just like you to think of him and not of yourself, Miss Pamela. Rest assured that he's just fine. Matter of fact, I happen to know that he went over to Dallas to visit his sister 2 weeks ago. I reckon he forgot to tell Mr. Brooks to cancel his grocery deliveries. It seems the gang moved in soon after he'd left, taking advantage of the empty house as a hideout. She nodded, taking a deep breath. Well, that relieves my mind considerably. But how did Sheriff Callahan know where to find me? He came to me, of course, as soon as Johnny O'Dia had left and he had the posse ready to ride out. And I took him to Mr. Brooks, who provided us with a list of the deliveries he asked you to make. The fellows, bless 'em all, they spread out right quick and found that you were accounted for at every ranch and farm, save for one. Charlie rallied 'em round, told me to come along and wait at a safe distance, and rode in with guns ablazing. She chuckled. It was something to see. I'll be sure to spread the tale around a bit, so's those in Settlers' Chance who have any doubts about our sheriff understand his courage and his bravery. I'll do the same, Pamela said, meaning it with her whole heart. But when we left, there was still shooting going on. Oh, I reckon it was all over but the mopping up. But he didn't want to wait to get you out of there and away from harm. Pamela shook her head, puzzled. I don't know why it should have mattered all that much, she said. Surely it might have been easier for him if he had caught them in the act, later when they were attacking the ranches. He might have gathered more backup, too, if he'd waited. I don't know why he was in such a rush. Don't you? Said Miss Eunice softly, eyeing her with a slight smile. She glanced towards the door, behind Pamela's head. Well, I reckon here's the one man who can set you straight. Pamela whirled in her seat to see Sheriff Callahan standing in the doorway. Somehow, she was both shocked, and not the least bit surprised. How long have you been there? She gasped. He grinned at her. Just long enough, he said. I reckon you and I have a few things to talk on, Miss Hastings. He strode towards her, and before she knew it, he had reached down to clasp her hands, pulling her up to a stand and close against him. One hand slipped around the back of her neck, plunging into the midst of her loosened curls, and he pulled her even closer still and pressed his lips to hers. In shock, she yielded for a moment before regaining control of herself and pushing at his chest until he stepped back, still grinning. She gaped up at him for a moment, then quickly glanced to the other side of the table, where Miss Eunice had been just seconds before. Evidently, the kind older lady had seen fit to absent herself, allowing them time to converse. Sheriff Callahan. Oh, come on, now, Pamela, he said. I reckon you can give in at last and call me Charlie. I heard you hollerin' through the door of Old Man Potts' house, after all. She shook her head at him, planted a hand in his chest once more, and shoved him back another step. No, she declared. I'm afraid you don't get off that easily, Sheriff Callahan. You think that just because you ride in to rescue me and then come and kiss me that I'll just forget that we haven't so much as discussed our engagement. Well, I'm not that easily overcome. I figure not, he agreed, still grinning. I don't think I could overcome you if I wore myself to the bone tryin'. All right, Pamela Hastings, I promised you we would talk, and so talk we will. Will you sit down? She did, and so did he, in the seat next to her. He turned it to face her and reached out to hold his hands to her, palms open, allowing her to take his hands or not, just as she would. She searched his face and found no hint of that wolfish grin, for once. She put her hands in his, and he closed his fingers over hers. Here's the long and the short of it, he said. I think I fell in love with you as soon as I laid eyes on you, Pamela. In fact, I know I did. I'd had my doubts about writing for a bride, and maybe I never would have done it if Boone Walker hadn't dared me that evening at the saloon, but the truth is, I've been wantin' to be married for a long time. Not just because I'm gettin' a little older and all the other fellows my age have families of their own. No, I wanted someone who could match me, fight for fight, who would be there when I came home at night. Someone to cry over me, if I should fall to an outlaw's bullet. Someone to rejoice with me, whatever joys in life might come to us both. I suppose you could say I was on the fence about Maureen, right up until the moment that you walked into me comin' around the corner. She opened her mouth to object to this, but he held up a hand to stop her. Just let me finish, Pamela, and then you can have your say. Well, I was pretty set that I wanted to marry you, but I knew that my manners left something to be desired. Anyhow, it wouldn't have been right to force you to stick to an engagement that was made in such an unusual way. Not if you'd changed your mind about it. And I couldn't simply leave the town of settlers chance high and dry while I focused on romance, could I? At least, that's what I told myself. So, I was as honest with you as I knew how, and I hoped that you'd wait, and meanwhile, I applied myself to rounding up or chasing out all the varmints that have tried to take over this whole county. I tried to keep myself busy, distracted, and succeeded, for the most part, until that day in Mr. Brooks' store when you stood up for me like that. His smile returned, but it was soft, almost helpless. I had an inkling then that I had fallen for you, and fallen hard, but it wasn't until Johnny O'Dia told me that you were captured by Sam Riggs and due to be held hostage to their bad behavior that I realized just how lost I was. I could hardly force myself to wait until I'd gathered a posse. I was riled up, ready to ride out and scour the countryside until I found you, come hell or high water. It was Miss Eunice who brought me to my senses. Wait and plan, Charlie, she said, and then she said, and while you're at it, maybe you can talk some sense into yourself and make up your mind to tell that girl you love her, as soon as you've got her back. He shook his head with a rueful sigh. There it is, Pamela Hastings. I love you, and I want to marry you, and I ought to have told you this 2 months ago when you first arrived. But I asked you for patience, and God knows, a darn fool like me needs it. That's all. It's your turn, Pamela. Say your piece. She stared at him for a moment longer, her mind in a whirl and her heart so full that it was difficult to find the words. But perhaps, her mind whispered, she didn't need words at all. Shaking only slightly, she got up from her seat and took one step towards him. He sat up tall, looking her in the eye. She turned and sat in his lap, wrapping her arms about him. His arms were around her in return, in the blink of an eye, and they held each other at long last, curled up tight as kittens, with nothing between them but understanding and love. Chapter 10. On the day before her new life started, Pamela Hastings dressed with care. No, it wasn't quite time to put on the wedding dress. As hard as Miss Eunice had been working on it over the past week, it still wasn't quite ready. She couldn't blame the older woman for that. After all, it had been another hand-me-down from her mother and needed a great deal of adjustments and mending. But the well-worn fabric was soft to the touch, a dove gray that would be ideal for her wedding day, and besides, it had been her mother's. To wear it would be to feel that Lydia Hastings was there with her, on the happiest day of her life. So, although both Charlie Callahan and Miss Eunice had offered to buy her a new dress, she had turned them down with thanks. How many new lives did one girl have? She wasn't sure. She counted 3 at least, but after all, she wasn't done yet. This morning was due to be full to the brim of last-minute tasks. They had already spoken to the preacher, of course, who was glad to arrange for them to be married within a week of their official engagement. She was happy about that, and so was Charlie. Neither of them had wanted to wait. As Charlie pointed out, they had already waited long enough. She did have to send a telegram back to the matrimonial agency, to inform them of their nuptials at last. Aggie was hard at work on a wedding cake in the kitchen. She had promised her to go and collect some flowers to decorate it. Mr. Brooks had asked her to stop by, not for work, as he assured her, but to give her his wedding present. She hadn't the faintest idea what it might be, and it was simply a pleasant mystery to look forward to. After all, what did she need but what she already had, the man she loved, and the life she was living? She met the sheriff as she left the boarding house behind. He was coming around the corner towards her, hands in his pockets, whistling, and she only just stopped herself from running into him. They looked at each other and laughed, and he took his hands out of his pockets and put them around her instead. Good morning. Good morning, she whispered back, pressing a kiss to his mouth. Where are you off to? The post office. I need to send a telegram. I'll walk with you, if you don't mind. I'm on my way there myself. He fished a folded piece of paper from his pocket and waved it at her. Final report on the arrest of Riggs and his gang, to be sent off to Marshal Hornsby over in Dallas. He'll be here soon, but I wanted to tell him while it was fresh and exciting. Do you really think that you'll be able to clean out the rest of Cook County, with the help of the marshals and the rangers? They swung into movement together, arm in arm, meandering slowly down the street towards the post office. I hope so, Callahan said soberly. It'll take some time, I know that, and maybe a new batch will come in as soon as we get rid of the old. But you can't hold back, can you? Not from doing what's right. She squeezed his arm. No, she agreed. You can't. And I'll be your backup, Charlie, every step of the way. He smiled in the brilliant late spring sunlight, putting a hand over hers at the crook of his elbow. The conversation between them meandered as much as their steps, but they found their way to their destination at last. While Callahan wrote out the envelope for his bulletin, Pamela went to the counter. Good morning, Mr. Raft. I'd like to send a telegram, please, back to New York. Oh, Pamela. Well, surely, oh, before I forget. You received a telegram yourself, just last week. She blinked at him. I did? Last week? I would have brought it to you, but I figured you were busy enough what with plannin' your wedding and all. The older man nodded to Callahan, who nodded back with a grin. It didn't seem like anything that couldn't wait. Just a note that some friends are on their way to visit you. Pamela frowned. Friends? She took the paper from Mr. Raft and read it over swiftly. She was not conscious of more of a reaction than a faint gasp, but something alerted Callahan, and he looked up swiftly. Pamela? What's wrong? You've gone pale. She lifted her eyes to his, faltering. It's from the agency, she said. They tell me that a friend had inquired of my whereabouts, and said they wanted to come to my wedding. They gave him my address. A friend? Who? She shook her head and drew a shaky breath. No friend of mine, she said. His name is Daniel Darnon. Sheriff Callahan sent a swift glance to Mr. Raft, who shrugged his shoulders. He put his arm around his young bride and directed her outside into the sunshine. What is it? He said gently. Tell me. They walked together as she spoke, telling him the whole story, and leaving nothing out, her mother's debt, compounded by her own, the lawyer's advice, and Darnon's proposal, followed by her abrupt exit from the town of her birth. They found themselves on the main street of town once more, several blocks away from the safety of the boarding house, not far from the stagecoach stop, and just outside the swinging doors of the saloon. Even this early in the day, there was already a raucous noise coming from within, but the sheriff didn't spare a glance for the riot. His eyes were fixed lovingly on Pamela's pale face. And now the matrimonial agency has told him how to find me, she finished. He must know that I made my plans only to get away from him, and he's not the sort of man to let a debt go, Charlie. Suppose he comes here? Suppose he's here already, said a voice from behind them. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she reached out to grasp Callahan's hand, turning slowly to face the man who had come in search of her. Yes, there he was, every familiar feature vile in its familiarity. He gave her what passed for a smile, though his eyes were cold, and burned with a frigid fire as they settled on the joined hands of Pamela and Callahan. I believe you owe me something more than what you've given, Miss Hastings, which is hardly surprising, for all you've left me was an empty hand and a broken promise. She caught her breath, the strength in her voice surprised her as she replied. I promised you nothing, Mr. Darnon. I said only that I would think about it, and I did, for all of 30 seconds. I would never marry someone like you, not if I had to pay down my debt for the rest of my life. That might be an acceptable compromise to some, he snarled, losing his calmness in the face of her strength, but by this point you owe me far more than you could ever pay, not in 10 lifetimes. And you, fellow, he addressed Callahan, who stood beside her, fingers tight around hers, without wavering. I reckon you can forget about any plans you might have, right here and now. Miss Hastings owes me, outright, I have a contract. And if she isn't going to marry me, she can pay me right here. He brandished the paper at them. Still trembling, Pamela turned to face him. It's true, we have a contract, she said, her voice low, feeling as though she were confessing to something terrible. It started with my mother and continued with me. It's far more than I could ever pay, and it isn't fair, of course, but there's nothing I can do about it. If I took him to court, they would only rule in his favor. I tried to run away, but I won't do it again." He tilted his head at her, questioningly. "No? Even if you knew he wouldn't follow?" She shook her head, eyes fixed on his. "There's nowhere else I want to be," she said. Sheriff Callahan nodded thoughtfully. He let go of her hand and stepped forward, eyes on Mr. Darnan's pale face. "I'm the sheriff in these parts," he said, "and I've a good idea of the ins and outs of the law. If you've got a contract, Mr. Darnan, then it ought to be honored. May I see it?" He held out his hand, and Darnan handed the paper over without hesitation. His eyes were gleaming with triumph as he looked back at Pamela, who bit her lip to keep from crying out in protest. Of course, Callahan was the sheriff, the lawman for all of Cook County. He would have to see justice done, one way or another. He would have to. Quickly and methodically, Callahan ripped the paper into shreds. He tossed it into the air, and the light, fresh breeze that had sprung up to stir the heat of the May day spread the scraps far and wide across the town of Settlers' Chance. "Of course," he went on, in response to Darnan's outraged stare, "if you don't have a contract, then I reckon there ain't a thing anyone can do about it." Daniel Darnan was so taken aback, so very unused to treatment like this, that he could only sputter. You. There's a judge in the county seat, over near Lummock," Callahan advised him. "It's about a day's ride that way." He pointed behind Darnan, obligingly. "He might sit to hear your case, then again, he might not. Depends on how his digestion is treating him that day. Otherwise, Miss Hastings and I are scheduled to get hitched tomorrow morning. You're welcome to come, of course, and see us happily wed." In the silence that stretched out between them, Pamela was certain that her heart was beating so loudly that it could be heard by all three of them. But Callahan merely grinned, and after a long moment, Darnan spoke. His voice was full of venom, but it shook all the same. You haven't heard the last of this, mister." "I reckon not," said Callahan. "But I've chased all sorts of varmints out of my town, Mr. Darnan, far bigger and badder than the likes of you. You'll hardly be more than a moment's work, if you choose to test me." His voice grew very soft. "But I wouldn't advise it." Darnan drew in a breath, his hand curling into a fist. Pamela squeezed her eyes shut, breathing a prayer, and when she opened her eyes, she found that the prayer had been answered. Daniel Darnan was leaving, headed back to the stagecoach stop. And far off in the distance, the sound carried across the wide Texas prairies by the brisk little wind, she heard wheels. He was gone, and she was still here. Callahan took her hand and turned her to face him. He smiled down at her. That wasn't exactly lawful, was it?" He shrugged. "Neither is what he was asking of you," he said. "I had to make a call, one way or another. I reckon no one on earth would argue that it wasn't justice, except maybe Mr. Daniel Darnan himself, and who wants to listen to him? But surely my debt, I still owe him something, don't I?" She frowned. "Do you? Seems like you gave him just about everything you had, except for yourself. You're too smart to give that away to anyone." He put his arms around her, but she wasn't entirely convinced. "But we'll send him a piece of wedding cake," Callahan said, grinning. "The way Aggie bakes, that'll be payment enough." She allowed herself to be convinced. "You keep doing that." "What's that?" he murmured. She smiled, winding her arms around his neck. "Surprising me." He bent to kiss her, and the wind swirled around them both, lifting her wayward curls and carrying a few lone pieces of paper out onto the wild prairie. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susanna Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susanna Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susanna Calloway Western romance.